On the eve of the Great War, the Bedfordshire Regiment had two regular full-time battalions, with the 1st Battalion stationed in Ireland and the 2nd Battalion in South Africa. The 3rd Reserve Battalion was comprised of men who had completed their time with the colours and were seeing their contracts out as part-timers in case they were needed in time of war. The 4th Special Reserve Battalion, also referred to variously as the Extra Reserve or even the Extra Special Reserve, was formed around an experienced cadre of reserves but made up from part-time, part-trained men who had no prior military service. The 5th Territorial Battalion was almost entirely filled with part-time soldiers who were liable to be embodied for service in the event of war. When the British Empire joined the war on the 4th of August 1914, the 1st Battalion became a part of the 5th Infantry Division and were amongst the very first wave of the British Expeditionary Force to land in northern France less than 2 weeks later. During 1914 they fought in the battles of Mons, Le Cateau, the retreat to Paris, the Marne, the Aisne, La Bassée and the First Battle of Ypres. The 2nd Battalion arrived in France as part of the 7th Division early in October and fought in the First Battle of Ypres, being reduced to the size of a company by the end of the battle and having lost 2 commanding officers in quick succession during the close quarters fighting amongst the woods east of Ypres. While the 3rd and 4th Reserve Battalions were posted to their war stations around Felixstowe, where they guarded the coastline and trained their reservists and new recruits to replace the casualties amongst the front line units, the 5th Territorial Battalion were embodied for war service and prepared to go overseas. The new armies, raised under Lord Kitchener's stern gaze, included the 6th, 7th and 8th Service Battalions who would all see active service on the Western Front. In all, 21 battalions would be formed within the regiment during the war, with 7 deployed as combat battalions, 3 as garrison battalions, and the remainder in home defence, recruitment, training and logistical roles. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915 saw the 2nd Battalion lose another commanding officer, just hours before Captain Charles Foss won the Victoria Cross in an audacious bombing attack. In April, the month after, Private Ted Warner was awarded the posthumous Victoria Cross during the 1st Battalion's costly defence of the infamous Hill 60, southeast of Ypres. The 2nd Battalion were also heavily engaged at the battles of Festubert in May and the 2nd Action at Givenchy in June. Kitchener's new army divisions started arriving in France that summer, and despite being wholly unprepared, the untried 24th Division were amongst the small contingent committed to the Battle of Loos in September, which included the 8th Battalion. The 2nd Battalion were once again heavily engaged during the battle, and conducted themselves superbly in the face of adversity, losing yet another commanding officer in the process, Lieutenant Colonel Monteith, who's seen here. But the 8th Battalion were amongst those new army units who had a bad introduction to the war. Having waited 6 months for uniforms and with no rifles to train with until June 1915, they were shipped to France and thrown headlong into the battle, having not so much as set foot in the front lines. Badly handled by senior generals and poorly led on the ground, they failed to reach their allotted positions in support of the 9th Norfolk's assault, which resulted in their commanding officer being on the long list of officers relieved and sent home. The 8th Battalion continued to suffer when in December 1915 and again in April 1916, they were subjected to an intense bombardment and localised assault by German forces, which saw them lose hundreds of men on both occasions. Losses on this scale were usually seen in major attacks, not during what were ultimately trench raids, albeit on a very large scale. Meanwhile, the 5th Battalion had gone somewhere out east and found themselves dealing with the incredibly difficult conditions on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where they lost half their number in their very first battle that August. In the process, they were christened the Yellow Devils, after their gold medal identification badges glinted in the sun as they advanced unflinchingly against the Turkish positions under intensely heavy fire. A senior officer was alleged to have remarked, "By Jove, give me a brigade of those Yellow Devils and we shall be across the peninsula inside a week." Nevertheless, courtesy of dysentery, which decimated units on Gallipoli and counted for more casualties than hostile fire, they left the peninsula that December with just 165 of the 1,000 men who had landed in August, and were shipped to Egypt, where they started the process of rebuilding. On the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme in 1916 saw all 5 battalions in that theatre heavily engaged. The 7th Battalion were in the assaulting front waves on the infamous 1st of July and were amongst just 2 divisions to take and hold their objectives, the 2nd Battalion being in the other division. Among the constant battles, enormous losses and a long list of gallantry medals, 2nd Lieutenant Tom Adlam of the 7th Battalion won the regiment's 3rd Victoria Cross during their storming of the impregnable, as it was quoted as being, Thiepval village and Schwaben redoubt in September. After the scale of losses became apparent in the opening weeks of the battle, the 4th Battalion were amongst 4 reserve battalions to be mobilised into a new brigade, who were attached to the renowned 63rd Royal Naval Division. They, along with several others, were engaged in the Battle of the Ancre that November and the winter operations which saw them chasing German forces back to the formidable Hindenburg Line. During those operations in March 1917, Private Christopher Cox, a stretcher bearer in the 7th Battalion, won the regiment's 4th Victoria Cross on the fire-swept slopes in front of Achy-le-Grand. That spring, all of the regiment's battalions in Europe took heavy losses in the Battle of Arras, which would see the highest daily casualty rate suffered by the British forces during the entire war. As testament to the sheer scale of losses, the 6th Battalion came out of their part in the battle, which culminated in their assault on Greenland Hill with just 58 men. Over in Egypt, the British and Commonwealth forces advanced into Palestine and fought the first 2 unsuccessful battles at Gaza in March and April 1917. The 5th Battalion saw action in both battles, but in July they raided a Turkish position in front of Gaza called Umbrella Hill so successfully that their divisional insignia, an umbrella blown inside out, was born. During the 3rd Battle of Gaza that November, the 5th Battalion were assigned the critical role of attacking the flank of the Turkish line next to the coast. They once more crowned themselves in glory, taking their objective despite heavy losses. As British intentions turned towards the political prize of Jerusalem, a scratch defence line left to defend Gaza was assaulted by a massed formation of Ottoman troops, the 5th Battalion putting up a determined resistance and holding their ground regardless of seemingly hopeless odds. Back on the Western Front, the 3rd Battle of Ypres pulled all of the Bedfordshire battalions into it, their continuing heavy losses being in line with all British and Commonwealth units in the area. 1918 started with a significant reduction to the size of the British Army, which simply did not have enough men available to fill the ranks. Within the organisation, junior battalions from all regiments were disbanded, with the 8th Battalion of the Bedfords being among them. The German Spring Offensive in 1918 saw the 2nd Battalion firmly in the middle of the battle from the very opening hours. A week later they were left with barely enough men to form a weak company, but had put up a formidable fight in the face of enormous adversity. The 7th Battalion fared a little better, although they suffered significant losses, and the 4th Battalion to their north were also heavily engaged, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Collins Wells, being awarded the posthumous Victoria Cross for his remarkable and utterly fearless leadership. The 1st Battalion's division were recalled from Italy and fought that summer around the Dnieper forest, while the army underwent a further reduction in size, with both remaining new army battalions, the 6th and the 7th, being disbanded. In Palestine, operations had been halted. Following the heavy losses on the Western Front, the 5th Battalion finding themselves in the only remaining British division in the theatre. Following localised operations over the spring and summer, the offensives resumed late that summer, with Private Sam Needham winning the Victoria Cross for his berserk fury during a nighttime fight which saved his entire patrol from annihilation. But for reasons we'll never know, he took his own life days after the armistice while in barracks in Egypt. Back in Europe, the Allies launched what would become known as the 100 Days Offensives, which ultimately led to the end of hostilities in November. During those costly battles, the 1st Battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Courtenay, seen here, was killed as he ran forward to encourage his men to continue their assault on a machine gun-ridden ridge just yards away from the slopes on which Christopher Cox won his VC 18 months earlier. The disbanded 6th Battalion's Captain Freddie Hedges won the Victoria Cross that October whilst attached to the 6th Northamptonshires. Although he received a bad head wound just days later, he survived but spent the rest of his life troubled. Sadly, he also took his own life in 1954, having also lost his only son in the Blitz in the Second World War. After over 50 months of war, the armistice came into effect on the 11th of November 1918. The regiment was left with just 3 battalions on the Western Front and the 5th Battalion in Palestine, all other combat battalions having been disbanded that year. Although firm numbers don't exist, based on the issue of service numbers, around 60,000 men served in the regiment in some capacity, whether at home, on garrison postings abroad or in combat roles. More than 1,000 gallantry medals were also awarded to men of the regiment, including the 7 Victoria Crosses I've touched on. But the cost was high. Firm casualty figures are also very difficult to establish, but somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men were wounded wearing the regiment's distinctive cap badge, and around 7,200 of them did not return home.